You're listening to Inside the Village, where all news is local and no topic is off limits.
So help me, Bob, it's bully in the alley. Hey, bully in the alley. So help me, Bob.
Welcome back to Inside the Village for another week alongside Michael Friscoletti, Editor-in-Chief here at Village Media. I'm Scott Sexsmith. Nice to be back. We are sans headphones and big mics this week.
Yes, I don't want people to be shocked, but we actually have our first in-studio guest, right?
We do, and the configuration of how it all works, it wouldn't mic arms and just, it's a lot simpler to do this, so they've hooked us up with these fancy rigs. And speaking of guests, Mike Cachagee, a residential school survivor from Sault Ste. Marie, will be joining us shortly. But before we get to that, as always, the first word to Frisco. Some great stuff this week. Let's go a little off script if we can, just for a moment. This is a podcast that we do. We've been doing it now for several months, and podcasts go back a few years, but really it started with one called Serial, and Adnan Syed, who is the topic of one, is back in the news.
Yeah, this case is fascinating, right? And I think everyone who got into podcasts really got into them listening to Serial years ago, which was that 10-part podcast that featured the case of Adnan Syed, who was accused of murder.
Right.
And the host took us episode by episode through her questioning the case and whether it was legit or not. All kinds of debate at people at the office talking about this case. But it was really the first true crime podcast, right?
Yeah.
And to be honest, I didn't think the guy was innocent. When I listened to the podcast, there were just too many things that made me think, no, this guy, he killed this girl and he deserves to be where he is. But this week, he was let go because they found some new evidence. He's not been found innocent. They're just deciding whether they're going to hold a new trial. But it just shows you the power of this podcast, right? There's no way this case would have still been in the news if not for that podcast. So as we sit here, producing our version of a podcast, it's interesting to go back and see how that one's had an impact.
No, we don't certainly yield that power.
Yes, we're not getting anybody out of jail anytime soon. Maybe you.
One day we will get there. All right, rumors out of Aurelia, and an interesting story there. What can you tell me?
Yeah, it's another great example of local journalism trying to get the facts straight, right? And I guess real quickly, there was rumors at a local nursing home in Aurelia that people had died from the COVID vaccine, that there'd been a clinic there and some people had died. Lots of rumors spreading on social media. So Dave Dawson, the ER editor in Aurelia, went and asked the nursing home what had happened, got to the bottom of where these rumors had started, and basically wrote a factual piece explaining that no, folks, people didn't die of this vaccine. This never happened. It's just rumors spreading on social media. What was great about the story is the lead said it all. Rumors were spreading more quickly than the virus this weekend was the lead. And you know what? I don't want to overplay this, but imagine there was no Aurelia Matters. These rumors would have kept swirling all over the city. Who would have went to ask the questions if it was actually accurate or not?
Absolutely.
That's the way I look at it.
And we've got a guy like Dave Dawson that can set the record straight.
Absolutely.
Which is terrific.
Absolutely.
And finally, a doctor out of Sault Ste. Marie in a bit of hot water.
Yeah, this story is one of those ones, too, where we could have another debate about how we cover the stories, how we do local journalism. But essentially, there's a doctor here in Sault Ste. Marie, a local family physician at the Group Health Center, who in the summer of 2021 was in a bad car accident, and turned out he was, a breathalyzer test showed he was over the legal limit. He was charged with multiple offenses, including impaired driving, criminal charges under the criminal code. In most cases, and we're supposed to believe all cases, the Sault Ste. Marie Police Service would have put out a press release like they do for everyone else saying, this gentleman had been charged with these offenses, this is when it happened, and it would have gone through the local news feed like all those things do on Sault Today. For whatever reason, it didn't happen. So no one knew, or at least no one in the public knew, that this doctor had been charged. Fast forward a year, him and his lawyer worked out a plea agreement where he pleaded out to a non-criminal charge under the Highway Traffic Act of careless driving. The key being that there's no criminal conviction of impaired driving, which would have showed up on the College of Physicians and Surgeons if you searched them out, and just avoiding that. And none of that was publicized. So when the story finally did come out, the question, some people were upset that he was able to plead down, but the bigger question was, why wasn't this doctor's name released in the first place? And we didn't jump to conclusions and say it's because it was done on purpose, but we've been asking those questions and we've been doing some reporting on that, because the bottom line is the justice system is going to run its course, and he's going to have his day in court, and if his lawyers and him work out a plea agreement, that's the way the justice system works. But if the Sault Police is going to release the name of Joe Blow charged with impaired driving, why wasn't this guy's name released? So we're trying to figure out Why that happened, people are asking a lot of questions, and it's a fair question. I mean, the police shouldn't be treating one person different from another. I'm not saying they did here, but people are wondering what happened here, so we're trying to get to the bottom of that.
All right, look forward to following that story and see how that unfolds. Coming up Friday, September 30th, a very important day, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And we have a very important guest, Mike Cachagee, who is a residential school survivor, and he's going to be joining us shortly.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to these conversations. I think of Orange Shirt Day. I think of my own kids now. They've got their orange shirts ready to go. We've come a long way in terms of understanding this issue. I'm not saying we've figured everything out. We don't have a long way to go. But it's good that we're having these conversations, and Mike's agreed to come on and talk about his experiences. But I think it's just another important part of learning more about this issue and what happened.
Absolutely. It's an important conversation, and we will have it with Mike Cachagee next when Inside the Village returns, brought to you by True North Mortgage.
From newsmakers to celebrities to other prominent guests, you'll find them all on Village Media's new interview series, Up Close and Personal. Join host Scott Sexsmith as he goes one-on-one with well-known Canadians to hear their story. Up Close and Personal. Look for it on your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
Welcome back to Inside the Village, brought to you by True North Mortgage. True North Mortgage, where you'll get great advice and save a pile of cash. You can find them online at truenorthmortgage.ca. You can see that Frisco and I have repositioned ourselves around the ITV table so that we can welcome in today's guest, who's Mike Cachagee, a prominent Indigenous rights activist, speaker, community leader, and residential school survivor. Mike, welcome to Inside the Village. It's great to have you.
Good to be here.
With September 30th being the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, no better guest than Mike to join us on ITV this week, Frisco.
We really appreciate you taking all the time, Mike. These are the kind of conversations we think we need to be having right now. We should have been having them a long time ago, but we appreciate the chance to have it now. Mike, I just want to begin. I think you were in the residential school system. You've spoken a lot over your life about that system. You went to 3 different residential schools, I believe, from the age of three to the age of 17.
Yeah, until I was, I went in there when I was 4, and they asked me to leave when I was 7.
Just reading that, I shouldn't laugh, Mike, because just reading that is shocking, really, that someone could be in that system that long.
Yeah, during that time, those are your formative years as a child. And I didn't realize really until later on in my life. I had a life when it goes back at my own history. I came out of those residential schools that broke and having no identity, and I took up drinking. I got into drugs, and I had a very difficult life for the first 20-some years of my life, from the time I was 17 until I was 41 or 42, and that's when I stopped drinking. And I've been sober now for 41 years and clean. And it wasn't after that until things started to make some sense in who I was. I didn't know who I am. I'd ask myself sometimes, who the hell am I? Who am I? I'd look in the mirror and I didn't know who I was. You see, you get your identity from your family. And I had no family. I came back home from residential school. My mother didn't know who I was. My older brother and I didn't know us.
Mike, can you take us back to when you were 4 years old? Were you and how you ended up in residential schools?
Because,
were you taken from your family?
my family was the only family that were on the reserve. Okay.
In Chapleau.
In Chapleau.
Right.
And there's a history to my family in the residential school. It's got to go back to my mother. My mother also spent 12 and a half years in residential school. And the reason why is goes back to, again, how the colonial government treated. My grandfather, whom I never met, served in the First World War. Okay? And he was Indigenous, married an Indigenous woman. And he was gassed. Mustard gas was used quite prominent by the Germans in the First World War, and it burnt all his lungs out. Okay, when he came back after the war for repatriation, because he was Native, he didn't get the same benefits or the same conditions that the non-Indigenous people got, that the white counterparts got. And they gave him only maybe a year to live at the max. Well, they used Indigenous medicine, and they kept him alive for 6 years.
Wow.
In that 6 years, his wife passed away, and he was left with 3 daughters. My mother's older sister, my mother and her younger sister. And when my grandfather passed away, my mother's younger sister was just a baby. So my great grandfather came in and took my aunt, who was the baby, and the Department of Indian Affairs came along and put my mother and her older sister in residential school. And that's the thank they got back for him serving in the Canadian military.
Wow.
And she spent 12 and a half years in residential school.
And how old was she when that would have happened?
I can't remember now. She was very young because she was only 16 when she got out, the same age as I was, 16. So it must have been around 4 or 5 years old.
Mike, I'm wondering if you can even put into words for us and for our audience what it was like growing up in residential schools.
It's institutional. It's 100% institutional. I was talking about that over the last couple of days. You go back to that little boy at 4 years old. The first thing that, when I walked into that building, the first thing that caught my attention was the electric lights. I come from a home, we had no electricity.
Mm-hmm.
We had coil oil lamps or candles, and I couldn't get over the brightness of it. But that would later play on me because I'd be sitting in a mall someday, and I'd get a flashback and I'd get overcome. I'd go back to that little boy again. But there's no one fending for you. You're on your own. You're basically all by yourself. My older brother would kind of look after me a little bit. But yeah, if somebody do something wrong, you got nobody to protect you. So you learn at a very, very young age and how to adapt to the system to protect yourself. And you see all around you, you see children getting beat, you see children being molested, and you learn to stay away from that and how to avoid it, and all the shortcuts and all the quick ways of avoiding it, because you're basically fending for yourself. And I've never had a chance during those 12 and a half years to develop this persona that I would find later on in my life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And for me to find out who I was later on in my life, I'm still working on it today.
Mm-hmm.
I have a father of 5 children, 6 children. I got my last marriage, and I wasn't much of a father to them because I didn't know how to father.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a better grandfather today than I was a father.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no one to teach me how to be a father.
Mm-hmm.
I still no one mothered me. So if you look back at the history of residential schools, and they went for 130 some years, at 100 per school, and you run the social multiplier, and we're a nation of people that grew up without mothers and fathers.
Mm.
You know, a friend of mine's passed away now from this area. He used to say kind of good nature to his children, be patient with me, because I was a man raised by a bunch of, he says I was a boy raised by a bunch of men in long black dresses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and it's as comical as it sounds, you'd have to look back and look at it, at the factuality of something, and say, wow, that's quite a statement.
And I think that's the thing. A lot of people think of residential as well. That was a dark part of our history, something that happened a long time ago. They don't think of the intergenerational trauma and how that's continuing to impact people today.
Yeah, recent studies look at that now at PTSD, and it all goes back into the frontal lobe of the brain and how you learn and how you retain. And it's proven now today that intergenerational impacts are in fact transmissible and passed on to. They're a fact. We can't use it anymore. And I see that. I see my behavior in my children.
Mm-hmm.
I see that.
Mm-hmm.
And then what bothers me is when I see my behavior being manifested through them and how they treat my grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And I can't do nothing about it, but I have to stop and talk to them about it. Mm-hmm. And because I know they're sometimes in fits of anger, and they're frustrated as I was, and they say, well, Dad, that's what I learned from you. You know, what do I say? Mm-hmm. I had no one to teach me. Mm-hmm. And if I could have done better, I would have taken the opportunity, but I didn't. No one taught me.
Mike, are there specific memories that when you look back, I mean, there's many you probably don't want to remember, but are there ones that really stick out that help people understand what it was like to be there?
I spoke of this. I could speak both languages. Mm-hmm. I could speak my language Cree, and I could understand English and speak it. So for the administrators and the operators at that school, I was an asset. because if they wanted to convey a message or convey some signal or whatever else, or an order or whatever else, and in the early part before the kids learned the language, they tell me in English, I could convey them in the language, okay? And I was an asset. And the children that we had that come to residential school, a lot of them came from remote communities that only had the one language, and they were learning as they went along. And they'd show us this movie, and of course, they're 8, 9-year-old children. They would mimic what they've seen in the movie, and of course, it's all in English. And this one supervisor said something to this young boy, and he went back to mimicking what he'd seen in the movie the night before, and he bowed and he says, "Yes, Your Majesty," to the supervisor. Okay, the supervisor took offense to that, thinking that he was being disrespectful, and he gives the little guy a backhander. He hit him so hard he knocked him out.
Wow.
So when the little guy got up, he started crying. And he said, "What did he hit me for?" He didn't have a clue why he got hit.
No.
After that, I quit being there, and all of a sudden, from being an asset, I became
The opposite.
the opposite. I became a liability.
The final report of the TRC estimates between 4,000 and 6,000 kids died in residential schools. Some of the causes of death include physical abuse, malnutrition, disease, and neglect. Others by suicide. During your time there, did you see any kids die?
When I was in Chapleau, the last 2 children that were buried there, I was there when they were there. I was only 7 years old. The last little girl we buried. The older boys went down and dug the hole. The older boys built a box. The older boys carried her. They had her in an auditorium and sitting up in this wooden box. And when you got a child here that's 8, 9 years old that passed away, no one crying. Not a soul crying, no mourning. And as a child, I'm looking at her laying in there, and I don't know. I have no feelings. I don't know what I'm supposed to do or what I'm supposed to say. And the same with the little boy. When I was in Moose Factory, Matthew Ash's brother, Matthew, used to be an MP, pardon me. His brother passed away up there. And all they could give him for comfort was aspirin. So the hospital was full, and all they could do was give him aspirin. And they asked him, "What did you want? What would you like to make you more comfortable?" He said, "Chocolate." Well, we only had the one store on the island, which was a Hudson-based store, and she sent one of the boys up to get him a chocolate. By the time he got back home to school with the chocolate, the little boy died. Clifford Blackned lived next bed to me. We went out in the land to come back Monday morning, and he was dead. The bed was stripped, and he died over the weekend when I was in the bush.
And did they bury him there, or did they try
We
to
buried him there and didn't send him home. They never sent no one home.
And that's what's shocking is that these 4,000 to 6,000 kids, or however many thousands of kids it was, the vast majority there was no effort to alert their families back home or send home.
They didn't care.
Yeah.
There was staff in there that cared, and there was other staff that didn't. They didn't have the time to care. A lot of those staff members in there were struggling themselves. A lot of them came in. They were idealistic. They came from the local churches, local parishes. They had these visions of these Christian visions. They were going to do this and do that and that. Well, the system broke them. This system wore them down. And they became people in personas that they had no intention of becoming. They became abusers because the system just sucked them in and ate it up. And it was part of the like a bishop once said, it wasn't a good system with bad people. It was a bad system with good people, with some good people. And it ate you up. It ate the students up. It ate the administrators up, and it ate the staff up.
And the goal being to assimilate, to get rid of the culture that.
Well, they wanted the land. They wanted the resources, and who owned the land and the resources. You see, I told you there, I don't subscribe to the truth and recon to the TRC concept. We have a movement in which I belong to, we call it real consideration. Okay, and it's based upon inherent right. I have the inherent right to learn my language. I have the inherent right for freedom of self. I have the inherent right to raise my family. I have the inherent right to teach my family. All these things that were given to me by the Creator. I don't need a 93 document or an edict coming from the government of Canada to say, we're going to give you this to apologize what you did for me.
Mm-hmm.
I have an inherent right to do that, and that was given to me by the Creator. My ancestor, or my lineage goes back to 20,000 years here.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't waiting for a boat to come from Europe with some guy with a swashbuckling sword to step up and say, I'm going to give you this.
Right.
I already had it, and that's my inherent right.
Mike, if we can fast forward to 2008, when then Prime Minister Stephen Harper delivered his apology to residential school survivors. You were on the floor of the House of Commons that day. Can you walk us through that experience and maybe explain your feelings that day?
Very emotional. It was very, very heavy, very hard. And I wasn't thinking of me or myself. I was thinking of some of my family. I was thinking of my older brother. I have a younger brother, Jim. He was 3 years old. There was 3 of us went to res school. My older brother, Sonny, me, and my younger brother, Jim. Jim was only 3 years old. Jim stayed there till he was 17. Jim never had a chance. Never had a chance. He passed away 3 or 4 years ago in Winnipeg, but he spent most of his life just one notch above a street person in Manitoba. Alcohol abuse, drug abuse, just lived in an old seedy hotel in downtown Winnipeg. Just never had a chance, and that's who I was thinking about at the time of the apology. And how do you, and the strange thing I was telling you about that apology, we collaborated with Canada, the National Residential School Survivors Day, on the wording of the apology. Some of that text in there came from us, and we were trying to sneak in that whole concept and whole wording of genocide, but they wouldn't approve it. I think the wording of and I think at that given time there was a certain amount of sincerity in the House. I think a lot of the members of the Parliament were sincere in what they felt and what they expressed that day, and I think to a degree so was Prime Minister Harper. Okay, I met with him in his office before we went onto the floor, and he seemed genuine, and for that, that's as much as I could ask. You know, I couldn't ask for any much more. If you're going to read that written text, at least, and he did. I think he did. There was a degree of sincerity. So I felt, with the apology, I felt quite satisfied with the way in which it was delivered and the content of it.
I remember that day too, Mike, and I do remember a lot of the attention, and it seemed like people understood the moment and what was happening. But I didn't feel that a lot of Canadians still really understood the stories that you're telling today. And I feel like maybe last summer there was a bit more of our eyes opening after the discovery of 215 potential unmarked graves in Kamloops.
Yeah, well, I think there's more to that. I did a 2 series of workshops for Ontario judges, 34 or 40 judges. And one of the questions they asked me was, where do we go from here? As Canadians. As members of the Canadian Society, what we have to do is we have to take that whole history of residential schools and put it on the table and look at it objectively, not subjectively, objectively. And put it in and look at it not as a venue to blame, not as a venue to feel guilty of, but look at it objectively and with a degree of comfort that there's no judgment going to be passed upon either side, no excuses given. And I think only then when we do that will Canadians really fully understand the implications of what their forefathers did to me. You know, and we have to do that. And I think they're doing some of that to some degree now in the schools. And I do workshops with children, and it's the youngest ones The most difficult people I have problems with are the ones with education or university students. The easiest ones that comprehend and can grasp some of the issues that I identify and bring in conversation are the children. The children, I was in a residential school for 12 and a half years, never seen a birthday. Now you got 120 children there, surely one's going to have a birthday. Not a birthday in 12 and a half years. When I talk to adults, they'll shake their head, well, can that happen? But when I talk to children, 7, 8, 9 years, what do you mean, no birthday? To them, it's very personal, and it's a personal issue. And they grasp that right away.
Mike, speaking of children, I see the beautiful necklace that you're wearing today, the orange T-shirt. And we do see that children are much more engaged in this. I mean, my own kids are participating in Orange Shirt Day on the 30th.
Again, I spoke earlier about the children, okay? And I think if we're going to really, really fully grasp and understand this whole legacy of residential school, will be this new generation coming up. And they haven't had the time or the opportunity to absorb any guilt on it. You've got a grandfather or somebody else that knew that worked in a residential school. And so there's a certain amount of guilt and a certain amount of responsibility attached to it. But these young children, they don't have that. When they're willing, they want to learn, they want to see what happened, and they want to make sure it never happens again.
We talk about this word reconciliation, and you've had some thoughts on it today. What is there? Is there a path to full reconciliation?
There's no word in my language for reconciliation. When I was working for the Assembly First Nations, we were going up doing these public consultations, and I'd go up with my people up in the James Bay area, the Cree-speaking people, and I'd do a presentation, and I always call it in Kringlish, half English. And the old people would put the Mooniganissatan, they'd say, Mooniganissatan, we don't understand. And I thought it was just my presentation that they were speaking. It wasn't. It was that whole dynamic associated with residential schools, why it came about and how it was maintained, that they couldn't understand. And it wasn't until years later that I went to do some work for another Native organization 3 or 4 years ago. The linguist came back, and I asked him about it, and when he came back, his Nisitanamoan means an understanding. See, if I don't understand you, or take the time to understand you, and you don't take the time to understand me, there'll never be conciliation. Never. And you see that in labor relations. It's his fault, her fault, this fault, And it goes back to that basic understanding of understanding me on the same level you as a human being. And respecting who I am, and me respecting and understanding you of who you are.
So if reconciliation isn't the word and maybe understanding is the word, does full understanding commence when all unmarked graves have been discovered? Is that
well?
Really?
It's part of that. You can't go back and take a segment of history that you don't like. Well, I'm not going to talk about that because it's not palatable. I don't like it. I don't like what happened to those children in that grave. Well, somebody buried them there. Somebody was there when they died. And there was an adult in charge. Okay? But you got to go back a little bit further than that, and some say, well, there are crime scenes. Well, so every one of those residential schools was a crime scene. There were children molested there. There was an incident here in the Sault Ste. Years ago where a Catholic priest molested a young man. The young man took the Catholic diocese to court. He got $1.1 million for being sexually abused by a Catholic priest here locally. I took Canada to court. I got $110,000. Now, what's the difference between me being molested, sexually molested, beaten, starved, put through child labor, kidnapping, and then a little boy being abused by a Catholic priest here in Sault Ste. Marie? Is it $1 million difference?
It makes you ask that question.
It does.
Yeah.
You put a number on it.
And then, where does my mother fit in on this? We had an incident where Canada, when the settlement agreement first came out, Canada wasn't happy with the National Residential School survivors' position. So they called us to Ottawa. Myself, my executive administrative assistant, and our ED. and they're going to give us a cigar, and they want us to recant. So we meet over, and it was Hull at the time before it became Gatineau. We meet in this dusty little room where there was a deputy minister and then a bunch of bureaucrats, and they're on one side of the table, we're on one side of the table. So the deputy minister sitting across where we were sitting, and I looked at him, and we got around, and they finally came around after all the platitudes and all the blah, blah, blah. They asked us, why aren't you supporting the agreement? I said, I'm going to ask you a question. I said, and if you can give me an answer that's acceptable to me, we'll leave this meeting, we'll go down to the National Press Gallery, and the Assembly, or the National Residential School Survivor Society will recant everything we've said, and we'll put full force and support behind the settlement agreement. Can you agree to that? I said, then the question doesn't have any strong, big legal implications, so we can leave DOJ out of this. And if you feel that it's okay, you can answer. So they caucused. I came back about 15 minutes later and said, yes, might be. We can. We'll ask you, what's your question? And I looked them in the eye and I said, what is the love of your mother worth? What is the love of a child's mother worth?
There you are, left alone in these schools.
Tell me what it's worth. Well, they looked at each other and he said, oh, Mike, it's incalculable. We can't give you that answer. I said, bullshit. You paid me $3,000 a year from taking me from my mother. You put a value on that. Three of the women in there started to cry. So you go home at night and you look at your child in the face at the dinner table and say, I'm going to sacrifice you for $3,000 a year. Will you go?
When you put it that way, Mike, it's just...
No, and he got up and he said, the three of the women got up, one left the room crying. He said, the meeting's over, Mike. We come back to sue. 6 weeks later to cut my funding off.
Jeez.
You know?
Mike, I want to ask you about the Pope. He made many statements over the summer. He visited Canada. You obviously watched it closely. What did you think?
I think given the opportunity, and I have differing opinions of some of my own people on this. I think given the opportunity, the Pope knew and felt and knew the wrongs were that had committed. But I think he was bound and had so many restrictions on him.
Right.
I don't think the poor guy could really, like I often said, could defecate or fart without
Somebody giving him permission.
without him getting the sign of the cross and getting permission. You know, and the unfortunate part about it, when he was given a headdress, Willie, a friend of mine, that was all staged. You know, Canada paid, the Catholic Church paid, and it was all staged and to make it look like this and look like that. And again, it ended up as a sham. You see, and the ones I feel bad are the general population of Canada, and I feel bad about the people that attended the Roman Catholic Church that really believed that something good was going to happen with the pontiff. You know, and again, like I said, given the opportunity, and if we could have taken the Pope aside and taken him for a boat ride down the loch or something else, it would have been an entirely different situation than what we've seen on the national television.
Mike, as we approach September 30th and the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, what do you think that we as a society, we as Canadians, should be thinking about, not only on that day, but moving forward?
I think it's a good time for reflection. You know, and do it objectively, like I mentioned earlier, because you can't do it subjectively, because there's too many factors that'll enter in that whole aspect when you start doing that subjective application. And once you start becoming subjective, you become a victim. Okay, and you can't come up with a decent or a convincing argument if you're victimizing yourself. So Canada has got to step back outside that and look at it objectively and say, yes, this was an ugly part of our history. This is what we've done. We created the genocide of these Indigenous people, And over the years, we've tried to correct it, and we've did a shitty job doing that. And we're still doing a shitty job doing that. This man sitting here at this table saying I have an inherent right to raise my children, to do this, to do this. Why do we let him do it? What's so difficult about letting him do what he believes the Creator granted him? Why does, what makes us right because of who we are and the color of our skin as opposed to him? No, we're all human beings. I have the same mental capacity as you, and you have the same mental capacity as I have. You know, and all we want is the opportunity to equalize. Maybe we should call it a day of equalization.
You actually graduated from Algoma University.
Yeah, I was the first graduating student that went to the residential school. I graduated at Algoma.
That's unbelievable. Can you even speak to that? I mean, what was that like to go back there as a university student?
You know, it was difficult. There were smells, like odors, that in different situations that are in the building that never leave. They're there. And I always say it's in the woodwork. Algoma would be in the brickwork. And they were stripping the walls one day down in the students' lounge, and they stripped all the drywall off of all the board walls, and the smell, the scent came back. And I was sitting there, I was overcome by it. I had to leave.
It's unbelievable.
Or I'd sit there in that room looking around sometimes and think about a Saturday morning and looking at 20 children from 8 years old to 11 years old with scrub pails on a steel and a brush and a bar of soap scrubbing the floor, going across on their hands and knees. We had no custodians. They brought me here from up north to teach me how to milk a cow. I learned how to milk a cow and never milked one since. They wanted to make a farmer out of me.
Amazing. I could talk all day about this, Mike. We're all learning. We're part of the people who are learning more and more as we go. And it's these stories that I think matter to people, right? Hearing from people.
Well, with me, the hardest thing I had to do, and it was for my own mental being and actually my spirituality. And my identity comes from my spirit. And it's a forgotten element of, if you went to a doctor today and said, look, I think I'm having a problem with my spirituality, he'd throw a white coat on you and have you out of there. He said, we can only look at the mental and physiological part. And the forgotten element of who we treat and who we are today is our spirituality. And it took me a long, long time to get out of that. But in order to find that, okay, I had to forgive. As painful as it was, I had to look back and say, well, I have to leave that alone now. I have to let it go. I'm not going to forget it. But all the anger and all that had built up inside of me over the years, I had to release it because it was affecting me spiritually. And I could never become who I am today, full of hate. I had to get rid of it. And that was probably one of the most difficult things in my life. And the second most difficult thing I had to do in my life was to ask my family's forgiveness. That was probably, for the human aspect of it, that was probably the most difficult thing I had to do, was sit with my children and explain to them what happened. And my children today, some of them still don't understand. And some of them are still full of anger. I don't know if they have the right to do that, but it's a consequence of what I did to them and what he did to me.
Are you at the point now where some days go by where you don't think about your time in residential school, or is it still a daily thing?
Well, I think about it every day. I still have nightmares. You see, what we forget, and I forget it, and even us, the caregivers that work with residential school survivors, when you're speaking to me, you're looking at a man that's going to be 83 years old next month.
I can't believe that.
But I'm not.
Wow.
I'm not. When I go back and I start talking about my experience, I'm back to that little boy again. I'm that little boy, 8, 9 years old, 10 years old. That little boy that witnessed all that little boy that's seen all those horrors. And it'll take a while sometimes after me talking to you, just going home and having a gentle and a quiet prayer with myself, that I released that.
I wonder, Mike, after going through something so difficult, difficult is not even the right word, but yet you made it your mission to be an advocate for other residential school survivors. You were with all these associations. You wanted to fight for others, I guess is the
Well, I
right
had
term.
to.
Why?
There was bullies. There was bullies all around us. There was bullies within, and there was bullies among the staff. The system was a bully. The system, you know, institutions create a system to serve the institution. It doesn't work like that. The institution serves the systems. And you see that in government today, and that's what happened in those residential schools. And it depends how strong that system got and how weak the institution got. And that's what happened in those residential schools. The systems got so powerful that the school concept, there was no schooling about that. You know, Archie Stoney spent 17 years in a residential school and came out of there with a reading level of grade 4.
Yeah, school was not the gold educated.
No, he was a grunt. He was a great big strong boy that did all the grunt work. That's all they kept him there for. He was a slave, slave labor. But they won't admit to that. That's all in that common experience box.
Well, Mike, as we wrap up here today, I think it's safe to say that I can speak for Frisco and all of us. This conversation has been incredibly eye-opening, and to say the very least, humbling. And hopefully, through your words, that we achieve acknowledgement and understanding that we truly can get to truth and reconciliation. Thanks for doing this today.
For the latest in-depth features and enterprise journalism from your local writers at Village Media, be sure to check out The Big Read. The Big Read. It's the full story behind the headlines. Look for The Big Read on your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
Welcome back to Inside the Village, brought to you by True North Mortgage, where you'll get great advice and save a pile of cash. You can find them online, Frisco, at truenorthmortgage.ca. Wow, Mike Cachagee, what a story. Shocking to hear what he endured and others.
Yeah, and to think this idea that you could be 4 years old and taken from your home. We keep hearing this over and over. We know this history now. We've heard these stories, but
when somebody sits across the table from you
and tells you that, and you and I, we just couldn't even grasp that, the idea. Right? I could think of where I was at 4 years old and being surrounded by the love of my parents. This kid is talking about how asking a government official decades later, how much is your mother's love worth? Yeah. I mean, it's mind-blowing, to be honest, and I don't know if we could talk about this issue enough, to be honest.
No, we can't. And I think the thing that resonated the most with me is he said he's going to be 83 his next birthday. So, 65, 70 years ago, he suffered through this and still to this day wakes up in the middle of the night suffering from nightmares.
Thinking about it. And even it struck me too when he talked about his brother who passed away and who suffered from addiction. And it's that effect of those schools and the lingering effects of those schools and the intergenerational effects, right? I think, you speak to a lot of people and you understand that if a lot of the addiction issues that are going on in some Indigenous communities, or some people even here in Sault Ste. Marie, they can trace their roots back to that, those kids being ripped out of their homes 100 years ago, because it just has that trickle effect, right? As he said, how could he know how to raise his kids when no one raised him? Exactly. You learn that, right?
Yeah. And I think the other thing that stood out to me, and maybe it did to you as well, that in order to get, true truth and reconciliation, we have to get acknowledgement and a full understanding first. And hopefully we can all do our part Friday, September 30th, on the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. All right, that's a wrap for another week of Inside the Village. Thanks as always. Good to see you. We'll do it in 7 days.
You too, my friend.
All right, Inside the Village, brought to you by True North Mortgage, where you'll get great advice and save a pile of cash. You can find them online at truenorthmortgage.ca, and you can also find us online at insidethevillage.ca, across the Village Media Network, or wherever you get your favorite podcast. For Michael Friscolanti, Editor-in-Chief here at Village Media, I'm Scott Sexsmith.
You've been listening to Inside the Village.
Frisco and Scott's wardrobe provided in part by Moores, Sault Ste. Marie.